The United Nations General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly in favour of a resolution declaring the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. Even though all but 2 countries in Europe chose to abstain, 123 nations voted for the resolution, most of them from the global south. One of them is Brazil, the biggest recipient of enslaved Africans and the last country in the world to abolish slavery. Our reporter Jan Onoszko is in Rio de Janeiro at one of the ports which received the slave ships. Jan, tell us what this vote means for Brazil.
Well, I'm here at Valongo Wharf in the centre of Rio. It's the most powerful surviving physical witness to the gravest crime against humanity. That is what the transatlantic slave trade has been called by this historic UN resolution. Over the course of just 40 years, 1 million enslaved Africans were brought into the country via this stone ramp behind me. They were treated worse than animals. They were shackled in chains, they were traded in markets, and they were brutally punished. They were part of a trade which kidnapped and trafficked 12.5 million men, women and children over the course of 3.5 centuries, and 4.9 million of those Africans ended up here in Brazil. Now, this UN vote is not legally binding, but here in Brazil it's being seen as hugely symbolically important. That is because the country still suffers with the effects of slavery even today. Structural racism is deeply rooted in Brazilian society. If you are black, you are twice as likely to live in poverty compared to someone who is white. You're also half as likely to get a university degree, and you're also 3 times more likely to be murdered. Now, the Minister for Racial Equality, Aniele Franco, whose own sister Marielle was murdered in a politically motivated crime, has said that this UN vote now gives international legitimacy to the policies of racial equality being implemented here in Brazil. And that is really important because there are still many people in Brazil who deny that racism here exists. One of those people is the former far-right president Jair Bolsonaro, and in fact during his presidency he slashed funding for racial equality policies by more than 60%. However, most of the people we spoke to on the streets of Rio agree that racism is a problem in Brazil today.
If I were white, I reckon people's reactions in certain situations would be different. You know what I mean. You notice that when you walk past people on the right, they move their bags to the left. You start to pick up on these things. So it's not just about money. You could give them money or take the goal that's there and give it back, but that's not enough.
What's needed is education, you see. It's not just at school. It's at school, at home, on the street, in everyday life. Education is needed. People need to be re-educated. That's the word, re-educated. To look at others as you would look at yourself.
So Jan, will this vote strengthen calls for reparations for victims in Brazil?
Well, the resolution itself calls for reparatory justice, but it's really unlikely to take the form of financial payouts. The slave trade was carried out by European empires, and so, not surprisingly, every single country in Europe, except for 2, chose to abstain during this vote. It's really not surprising because they weren't going to admit to this crime and then be forced to put their hands in their pockets and pay reparations. Now, the arguments against reparations are that while the slave trade was being carried out, it wasn't illegal, it was legally allowed, and also that the slave trade happened so long ago that it would be impossible to identify all the victims of it. However, there is a historical precedent for paying a country reparations. That happened after the Second World War. Germany paid around 700 million euros to Israel because of the Holocaust. Now, ironically, Israel was one of only 3 countries to vote against this UN resolution. The other 2 countries were the United States and also Argentina. But here in Brazil, this vote is being seen as an opportunity to recognize all that really still needs to be done to address the legacy of slavery that still haunts the country in the form of racism and inequality. And the government here, Lula's government, has said that it's going to take a long time, but that it's committed to repairing these problems and really delivering reparatory justice.
All right, Jan Onoszko, thank you very much for that in Rio de Janeiro.